Mark Sterling did not wait for the divorce ink to dry. He picked up Barl's wedding photo off the mantel, looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, and dropped it straight into the trash. Then he called security. He had her key cards deactivated while she was still sitting in the courtroom. He had the movers throw her boxes onto the wet sidewalk like garbage bags. He had her name scratched off the building directory with his own hand. And when his attorney warned him to slow down, Mark laughed and said, "She built nothing. She is nothing." He was about to find out exactly how wrong he was. If this story already has your heart racing, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a single chapter. Drop your city in the comments below because I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let us begin. The rain started the moment Barl Vance stepped out of the courthouse. Not a drizzle, not a gentle spring shower. A cold, heavy, relentless downpour that soaked through her blazer before she even reached the bottom step. She stood there for a moment on the wet stone, clutching her purse to her chest, her heels already slipping on the slick pavement, and she thought, of course it rains today. She had dressed carefully that morning. A navy blazer, pressed slacks, pearl earrings she had bought herself on her 35th birthday. She had wanted to look composed, untouchable. She had wanted Mark Sterling, when he looked across that conference table at her, to see someone who did not need him, someone who had already survived him. But Mark had not even looked at her, not once. In nearly 4 hours of sitting across from each other in that beige, airless room, surrounded by attorneys and paralegal assistants who kept shuffling papers like they were counting down the minutes, Mark Sterling had looked at his phone, at his lawyer, at the ceiling, at his watch, anywhere but at the woman he had married 12 years ago. The woman who had cooked dinner while he studied for his MBA. The woman who had stayed up until 2 in the morning helping him rehearse investor pitches. The woman who had quietly, invisibly, built the foundation of the very company that now paid for his $5,000 suits. He had not looked at her once. And that, more than the legal papers, more than the words dissolution of marriage, more than the cold facts of what she was walking away with, that was what had broken something in Barl's chest she was not sure she could ever repair. Her attorney, a tired woman named Sandra Cole, who had clearly fought this battle more times than she could count, had pulled Barl aside just before they left. She pressed a hand to Barl's arm and said quietly, "I want you to know, what happened in there was not fair. You had grounds for much more." "Then why didn't we get it?" Barl had asked. Sandra had hesitated just long enough. "Because his legal team was very good, and because you insisted on not drawing this out." Barl had nodded and said nothing. She had insisted on that. She had wanted it over. She had thought that fast meant less pain. She understood now, standing on the courthouse steps in the pouring rain, that she had been catastrophically wrong. She pulled out her phone and called a rideshare. The app told her 7 minutes. She stood there and let the rain hit her face and told herself she was not going to cry. Not here, not on these steps, not where anyone could see. Her phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen. Mark's name. She almost did not open it. Some small, stubborn piece of her, the piece that had survived 12 years of being overlooked and undervalued, told her not to give him the satisfaction of an immediate response. But a larger, more exhausted piece of her simply could not resist. She needed to know what he was saying now, when the lawyers were gone and the cameras were off, when it was just the two of them reduced to typed words on a glowing screen. She opened the message. "The movers brought your things to the lobby this morning. Building management has your boxes. Security codes have been updated. Please do not attempt to re-enter using your old credentials. Your name has been removed from the directory. Do not return." She read it twice, then a third time. Not because she did not understand the words. She understood every single one. She read it 3 times because some part of her brain could not fully accept that this was real, that a man she had loved, a man who had held her hand in a hospital waiting room when her father was sick, a man who had once said to her, "You are the most brilliant person I have ever met," that this man had reduced the end of 12 years to a logistics update. Do not return. Not I'm sorry. Not take care of yourself. Not even goodbye. Do not return. Her rideshare arrived. The driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a kind face, glanced at her in the rearview mirror as she climbed in, soaking wet, and said, "You okay back there?" Barl opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'm going to Chelsea Arms," she said, "on Fairview." "Sure thing," he said, and he did not ask again, which she was grateful for because she was about 2 sentences away from completely falling apart. She pressed her forehead against the cold window and watched the city blur past in streaks of gray and yellow light. And she thought about the boxes in the lobby of the building she had helped decorate, in the apartment she had helped choose, in the neighborhood she had spent years learning. 12 years of a life packed into however many boxes, sitting in a lobby somewhere, waiting for her like lost luggage. She thought about where she was going. Chelsea Arms. Her college roommate, Dana, had moved back to the city 6 months ago and had been calling Barl ever since, saying, "Whenever you need me, I'm here." Barl had never thought she would actually need to show up at Dana's door. She had never thought it would come to this. But here she was. The car slowed. The driver peered at his GPS, then at the street, then back at his GPS. "This is the address you gave me," he said, uncertain, "but this doesn't look like an apartment complex." Barl lifted her head from the window. She looked out, and her first thought was that she was dreaming, or the rain was distorting her vision, or she had somehow fallen asleep, and this was the kind of bizarre, too vivid dream that came from sheer emotional exhaustion. Because the building in front of her was not Chelsea Arms. It was a mansion. Not a large house, not a nice townhome. A full, undeniable, old money mansion, set back from the street behind iron gates and mature oak trees, with stone pillars framing the entrance and warm light glowing from every tall, arched window. It was the kind of building that had a name, probably. The kind of place that appeared in architecture magazines and historical preservation guides. "This is wrong," Barl said immediately, sitting up straight. "This is not the right address." The driver frowned at his phone. "You typed in 4217 Fairview." "I meant 4712 Fairview," she said. That's a completely different street." He started to turn the car around, and then his tires hit a flooded groove in the driveway, and the car lurched hard, and there was a sound like something snapping beneath the undercarriage, and the driver swore under his breath and pulled to a complete stop. "I'm sorry," he said, and he genuinely looked it. "I think I just blew a tire on that drainage grate. I'm going to need to call this in. It's going to be a while." Barl stared at him, then at the rain hammering the windows, then at the mansion in front of them, with its warm-lit windows and its stone archway and its complete, absolute impossibility. "How long is a while?" she asked. 40 minutes, maybe an hour?" "I'm really sorry, ma'am. You're welcome to stay in the car, or—" She was already opening the door. She did not fully know why. She would think about that later, in the strange, quiet hours when she tried to make sense of what that night had set in motion. She would try to explain to herself why a rational woman, a woman with an MBA of her own, a woman who had navigated boardrooms and hostile negotiations and the slow, grinding machinery of a dying marriage, would get out of a car in the pouring rain and walk up to a strange mansion and ring the bell. She never came up with a fully satisfying answer. The closest she got was this. She had nothing left to lose. Everything she had spent 12 years holding on to was already gone. The worst thing that could happen now was a stranger telling her no. She walked up the stone path in the rain. She rang the bell. For a long moment, nothing happened. She heard the rain. She heard the distant sound of the driver on his phone behind her. She heard her own heartbeat, which was doing something unusual and rapid in her chest. Then she heard footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who was not accustomed to rushing for anyone. The door opened. The man standing in the doorway was not what she expected. She had expected. She did not know what she had expected. A butler, maybe? A security guard? Someone employed and uniformed and professionally indifferent. She had not expected a man who looked like this. Tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a plain dark sweater and reading glasses he had apparently forgotten to remove. He was holding a glass of something. Whiskey, she thought. And he was looking at her with an expression that was not alarm or annoyance or cold dismissal. He was looking at her with something that looked, strangely, like recognition, which made no sense because she had never seen this man in her life. "You're soaking wet," he said. His voice was low and even, not unkind. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. I have the wrong address. My driver had a tire problem and I needed to..." She stopped. She realized she did not actually have a complete sentence to offer. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I'll wait by the car." She started to turn. "Wait," he said. She stopped. "It's 40 degrees and you're soaking wet," he said. "Come inside. You can wait for your driver in the front hall. I'll have someone bring you a towel." She turned back, looked at him. "I don't know you," she said carefully. Something shifted in his expression, something that might, in different circumstances, have been amusement. "Julian Thorne," he said. He did not extend his hand. It was full with the glass, but he stepped back from the doorway in a gesture that was unmistakably an invitation. "And you are?" "Barl," she said. "Barl Vance." He nodded slowly, as if she had said something meaningful, and he was filing it away. "Come in, Barl Vance," he said, "before you dissolve completely." She hesitated for exactly 3 more seconds. Then she stepped inside. The front hall was warm and high-ceilinged, and the contrast with the freezing rain outside hit her so suddenly that she almost gasped. A woman appeared, middle-aged, efficient, clearly staff, and produced a large folded towel before Barl had time to drip onto anything significant. Julian Thorne leaned against the doorframe of what appeared to be a study and watched her with that same calm, assessing expression. "Rough day?" he asked. She almost laughed. It came out wrong, more like a strangled breath than an actual laugh. "You have no idea," she said. "Try me," he said. She looked at him, a stranger, a very wealthy stranger judging by the square footage she was currently standing in. A man who had, for no apparent reason, just invited a drenched, unknown woman in off his doorstep on a rainy Tuesday evening with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a calm voice. "I just signed my divorce papers," she said. "My ex-husband had my belongings removed from our apartment before I was even out of the building. I don't currently have a place to sleep tonight. I got in the wrong car, went to the wrong address. The car got a flat tire, and now I'm standing in a stranger's house in a blazer that cost me $200 and is probably ruined." She paused. "So, rough day is accurate." Julian Thorne was quiet for a moment. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, and then he said, "What did you do before today? What was your work?" The question caught her completely off guard. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "That sounds terrible," not the sympathetic head tilt she'd been getting all day from Sandra the attorney and the rideshare driver and the woman at the courthouse coffee cart who had slipped her an extra cookie without being asked. "What was your work?" She blinked. "Logistics. I was with Streamline Logistics for 8 years, chief of operations effectively, though that was never my official title." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and tried to smooth it out. "I developed the expansion strategy that took them from a regional carrier to a national platform. I built the client retention model they're still using. And then..." She stopped. "And then?" Julian said. Not impatiently, just waiting. "And then my husband decided he wanted a divorce," she said. "And apparently when that happens, everything you contributed to your spouse's company quietly disappears from the record." Julian was looking at her differently now. The calm assessment was still there, but something had sharpened behind it. Something had focused. "Streamline Logistics," he said slowly. "The pivot they made in 2019, the regional to national push, that was yours." She stared at him. "How do you know about that?" Because I almost bought them in 2020, he said simply. I spent 6 weeks analyzing that company inside and out. The strategy behind that pivot was the most impressive thing I had seen from a logistics firm in a decade. My team spent weeks trying to figure out who the architect was. He paused. The name that kept coming up internally was never the CEO. It was always a reference to a quiet influence, a shadow strategist. His eyes held hers. Was that you? The silence stretched between them. Outside, the rain was still pounding. Inside, something had shifted in the air of this enormous, warm, impossible house. Something Barl could not yet name, but could feel in the back of her throat like the first note of a song she had heard a long time ago. Yes, she said quietly, that was me. Julian Thorne nodded once, set down his glass, and said, I think you should come and sit down, Barl Vance. We have a great deal to talk about. She should have said no. She should have called another rideshare, sent it to the correct address, and gone to find Dana and her couch and whatever comfort a night among old friends could provide. She knew that. She was not a naive woman, and she was not, despite the disastrous events of the last 12 hours, an impulsive one. But she followed him into the study. It was a large room, warm and book-lined, with 2 leather chairs positioned near a fireplace that was doing its job beautifully. Julian gestured to one of the chairs, and she sat, and she held the towel around her shoulders like a blanket. And she looked at this man she had known for approximately 11 minutes and thought, who are you, and why does it feel like I already know the answer? I'll have someone prepare a guest room, Julian said, as if this were entirely ordinary. You are not going to find decent accommodations tonight, not with the weather, and I imagine you do not want to call in any personal favors just yet. People tend to ask questions. They do, she agreed, before she could stop herself. Then stay here tonight, he said. Tomorrow morning we can talk, properly, about streamlined logistics and about what you know, and about a few things I have been working on that I think will be of considerable interest to you. Mr. Thorne, Julian. Julian, she paused, looked at him steadily. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. He met her gaze without flinching. I know what you built, he said. That tells me a great deal. She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the rain beginning, gradually, to slow. In her pocket, her phone buzzed again. Probably Dana, probably Sandra, probably someone who knew about the day she'd had and wanted to check in. She did not reach for it. One night, she said finally. He nodded. One night. She leaned back in the leather chair and the fire crackled beside her, and she thought about Mark Sterling's 4-sentence message and the boxes on the lobby floor and the life she had just officially stopped living. She thought about 12 years of invisible work. 12 years of brilliant ideas in other people's names, of strategy sessions where her husband had nodded along and then presented her thinking as his own, of boardrooms where she had been the smartest person in the room and the least noticed. She had walked out of that courthouse today with nothing, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, she had walked into a warm room with a fireplace and a man who looked at her like she was exactly what he had been looking for. Her phone buzzed again. This time she glanced at it. Another message from Mark. She opened it without thinking. I saw you left the courthouse without speaking to the press. Smart. I've already spoken to Whitfield over at Forbes. They're running a feature on the Vortex merger next month. I thought you should know. Moving on has never felt better. The Vortex merger. She went very still. She had heard that name before. Not recently, but years ago, buried in a late-night conversation she was never meant to be part of, a phone call she had accidentally overheard through an open study door when Mark thought she was already asleep. She had not thought about it in years. She had filed it away in the same mental drawer where she kept all the things about Mark that had not quite added up. All the moments that had pricked at her instincts, but that she had been too busy, too tired, too committed to the marriage to examine properly. Vortex Corp. She looked up from her phone. Julian was watching her. You've gone very still, he said. My ex-husband just told me he's merging with Vortex Corp, she said slowly. Something changed in Julian Thorne's face. It was subtle, barely a flicker, but she caught it. She had spent 12 years reading rooms and learning to see what people were not saying. She caught it. Did he? Julian said. His voice was very quiet. You know that company, she said. It was not a question. Julian stood slowly from his chair. He walked to the window where the rain was still hitting the glass in irregular patterns, and he stood with his back to her for a long moment. Then he turned around. Barl, he said, and something in his voice had changed, gone from calm assessment to something more careful, more deliberate, like a man who had just decided to trust someone he had not planned on trusting quite yet. What exactly do you know about Vortex Corp? She held his gaze. Enough, she said. I know enough. He crossed the room slowly, sat back down in the chair across from hers, leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking at her with the focused intensity of a man who had just watched a single puzzle piece fall into place that changed the shape of everything else. Tell me, he said. Tell me what you know. All of it. The fire crackled. The rain continued against the glass. And Barl Vance, who had walked out of a courthouse that morning with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered sense of self, leaned forward in a leather chair in a billionaire's study and began to talk. She talked for nearly 2 hours. She told him about the phone call she had overheard 3 years ago. She told him about the financial patterns she had noticed in Streamline's client accounts, patterns that had made no sense to her at the time. Irregular payments to a holding company she could never fully trace. She told him about a conversation at a company dinner where a man named Gerald Voss, who she had then thought was simply a client, had said something to Mark that had made Mark go very pale and laugh too loudly in the way he only laughed when he was frightened. She told Julian Thorne everything she had filed away and never examined, everything she had noticed and then chosen to set aside in service of a marriage that was, it turned out, as hollow as a stage set. Julian listened to every word without interrupting her once. When she finally stopped, when she ran out of things she had been carrying without realizing the weight of them, the room was very quiet. Julian sat back. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you know what Vortex Corp actually is?" "A tech logistics firm," she said. "Publicly, anyway." "Publicly, yes," he said. "Privately, it is the primary vehicle through which someone has been systematically destroying the companies that competed with them over the last 7 years. Not through fair competition, through acquisition of proprietary strategy documents, through deliberate disruption of client relationships, through manufactured financial crises engineered at exactly the right moment." He paused. "I lost a company to them in 2021, my best company, the one I built from the ground up, the one I spent 15 years building, gone in 4 months, and I could never prove how." She stared at him. "They used your strategy," he said quietly, "the Streamline model, the one you built. They replicated it inside 3 of my subsidiary companies and used it to hollow them out from the inside." His jaw tightened. "I have been trying to find a way back in for 3 years, a way to understand exactly how they got their hands on that information." "Mark," she said. The word felt like swallowing glass. "Your husband was the bridge," Julian said. "I believe that now. I suspected it, but I couldn't follow the chain." He looked at her steadily. "You just gave me the first 3 links." The clock on the mantel ticked. The fire shifted and popped. Barl sat with this information and felt something unfamiliar beginning to move through her, something that was not grief, not anger, not the cold, empty exhaustion she had carried since that courthouse hallway. It was something warmer than that, something with edges and intention. "What are you planning to do?" she asked. Julian's expression was perfectly level. "I am planning to take back what was taken," he said. "I am planning to dismantle Vortex Corp piece by piece, expose what they are, and make sure that everyone who profited from stealing other people's work has nothing left to show for it." He met her eyes. "And I think that with what you know and what you can build, I can finally do that." She was quiet for a very long moment. "You said earlier you almost bought Streamline in 2020, she said. "I did. What stopped you?" "The asking price was too high for what I believed the stable long-term value to be," he said, "and because I could not identify who had built the core strategy. I do not acquire companies without understanding their real architecture." She tilted her head. "And now you've identified the architect." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was in that general direction. "Now I have," he said. She looked at the fire. She thought about Mark's message. Moving on has never felt better. She thought about 4 sentences on a glowing screen and boxes on a lobby floor, and 12 years of work that had been absorbed and rebranded and claimed by someone who had never once said thank you. She looked back at Julian Thorne. "Tell me what you need," she said. And this time, he did smile. Just slightly, just enough. "First," he said, "I need you to rest. You have had a catastrophic day, and we are going to need your mind completely sharp." He stood. "Mrs. Pierce will show you to the guest room. Tomorrow morning, breakfast at 8. And then," he paused at the doorway of the study and turned back to her with an expression that was quietly, absolutely certain. "We get to work." Barl Vance sat in the leather chair by the fire in Julian Thorne's study for 1 more minute after he left. She held the towel around her shoulders. She felt the warmth of the fire. She listened to the rain, which had finally, after hours, begun to ease. She thought about the woman who had stood on those courthouse steps 3 hours ago, soaking wet, homeless, holding a phone with 4 sentences on it, trying to remember how to breathe. She thought about what Julian had just said. We get to work. And for the first time since she had walked into that beige, airless conference room that morning and watched her husband look at his phone instead of her face, for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, Barl Vance felt something that was unmistakably, undeniably, like hope. She stood up. She followed Mrs. Pierce up the stairs. Tomorrow, everything would begin. She did not sleep well. That was the honest truth of it. The guest room was beautiful, she could tell that much even in the dark, and the bed was the softest thing she had touched in years. But Barl Vance lay on her back in that enormous quiet room and stared at the ceiling and replayed the last 16 hours of her life on a loop she could not shut off. The courtroom, the rain, Mark's message, the mansion door opening, Julian Thorne's face when she said the words Vortex Corp, the way his entire body had gone still, like a man who had just heard a sound he had been waiting 3 years to hear. She replayed it all, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, she stopped trying to sleep and simply lay there, thinking. Because here was the thing about Barl Vance that Mark Sterling had never fully understood, not in 12 years of marriage. She did not fall apart quietly. She fell apart loudly, intensely, completely. And then, when the storm passed, what was left behind was not wreckage, it was clarity. It was a woman who had burned through all the soft and tender things and arrived at something harder and more useful, something with edges. By 5 in the morning, she was sitting up in bed with the notepad she had found in the nightstand drawer, writing. Not a journal entry, not a letter to Mark, not a list of grievances or a catalog of pain. She was writing what she always wrote when her mind was working at full capacity, a strategy. Questions first, then patterns, then pressure points. What was Vortex Corp's actual ownership structure? Who was Gerald Voss, really? And how long had he been connected to Mark? What was the timeline of Julian's losses? And did that timeline overlap with anything she could trace back to Streamline's internal calendars, which she knew by heart? She wrote for 2 hours straight without stopping, and by the time pale morning light was coming through the curtains, she had 4 pages of tight, organized notes and the beginning of a framework that made something cold and certain settle into her chest. Mark had not just stolen her work, he had sold it, and she could prove it. She showered, dressed in the clothes Mrs. Pierce had quietly left folded outside her door the previous night, clean, simple, her size, which she did not ask about and decided not to question, and she walked downstairs at 7:58. Julian was already in the dining room. He was standing at the window with a coffee cup, looking out at the morning, and he turned when he heard her on the stairs. He looked at her face, just a quick, clean assessment, and said, "You didn't sleep." "I worked instead," she said. Something shifted in his expression. He pulled out a chair. "Sit down, eat something, then show me what you have." She sat, she ate. She did not realize until the food was in front of her how completely empty she was. She had not eaten since a vending machine granola bar at 8 the previous morning, 11 hours before her life had ended and apparently restarted in the same evening. She ate fast, which was not her usual habit, and Julian refilled her coffee without being asked and said nothing, which she appreciated. When her plate was empty, she put the notepad on the table between them. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Walk me through it," he said. "Gerald Voss," she said. That name came up twice in things I overheard over the years. I dismissed it both times because I had no framework for it. Now, I have a framework. Go on. 3 years ago, a company dinner. Voss was introduced to me as a client. Regional distribution, mid-sized operation, nothing remarkable. But the way Mark reacted to him, there was a deference there that didn't match. Mark doesn't defer to clients. He performs for clients. He deferred to Voss, like Voss had something on him. She tapped the notepad. 2 years ago, a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. Mark on the back porch thought I was asleep. I heard Voss's name, and I heard Mark say, and I remember this exactly because it didn't make sense to me then. He said, "The documentation is clean, Gerald. She doesn't know anything. She never does." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He was talking about you." "He was talking about me," she confirmed. "I thought at the time he was discussing a client deal I wasn't looped into. I told myself it was nothing. I was very good, for a very long time, at telling myself things were nothing." Julian was quiet. His fingers were on the table, very still. "What documentation?" "That's what I spent the night trying to figure out," she said. "Here's what I know. In 2019, when I built the national expansion model for Streamline, I did the entire thing in a private work system I set up myself, not on the company servers, on a personal cloud account Mark didn't have access to. I was protective of it because I had learned by then that my ideas had a way of becoming other people's ideas if I wasn't careful. She paused. But I accessed that system twice from the home network, just twice. I remember because I was careful about it, and careful people remember their mistakes. Julian's eyes were sharp now, completely focused. He copied the access logs. Or paid someone to, she said, and with the right technical help, an access log, plus a timestamp, plus a man in the right position at Streamline. She stopped, let him finish the logic himself. He finished it in about 4 seconds. He could document that you shared proprietary strategy externally, Julian said slowly. Frame it as a leak originating from you, which would give him legal cover if anyone ever traced the strategy back to its source. And explain why I walked out of that divorce with nothing, she said. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something that had been quietly burning since 3 a.m. when she had first understood the full shape of what had been done to her. Because he had leverage over me that I didn't even know existed. My own attorney kept saying we had grounds for more, and I kept wondering why the settlement felt like I had no ground to stand on at all. She watched Julian process this. She watched something move across his face that was not quite anger. It was colder than anger, more focused. The expression of a man who had just watched a long-running mystery finally come into focus. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "About 12 hours, she said, give or take." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "In 2021, when I lost my company, Meridian Logistics, the unraveling started with a document that surfaced from their legal team, a strategy document they claimed had been independently developed. My team looked at it and knew immediately it was too close to mine to be coincidence, but we couldn't prove origin because the authorship metadata had been scrubbed." He looked at her steadily. "I spent 2 years trying to trace it back to a source. The The trail went cold every time. 3 different private investigators, 2 law firms. He stopped. Barl went very still. What was the document about? Client retention framework, he said. Predictive modeling for logistics attrition. The specific kind of modeling that reduces long-haul client dropout by identifying micro-stress points in the delivery chain before they become failures. She stared at him. She had built that model. She had built it in 2018, 14 months before she built the national expansion strategy. It was her first real breakthrough, the piece of work she was most proud of, the framework she had spent 8 months developing from scratch, testing in secret, refining in the margins of a marriage that had never once asked her what she was working on. She had shown Mark, once, in the early days when she still believed that sharing her best thinking with her husband was a form of intimacy. She had never seen that model appear in any streamlined documentation. She had wondered about it, vaguely, in the way you wonder about things you have chosen to stop asking about. Now she knew where it had gone. "That was mine," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "That model, the client retention framework, I built that." The dining room was very quiet. Julian looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Then what was taken from me was taken from you first." Something cracked open in her chest, not the soft, helpless crack of grief she had been carrying since yesterday morning. Something harder than that. Something that cracked open and let heat out. "Yes," she said. He leaned back. "Barl, what I am about to tell you, I need you to understand that I have not told anyone else. Not my legal team, not my financial advisors, no one." He paused. "Because what I'm planning is not a lawsuit. It is not an investigation. It is not a press release." His eyes were completely steady. "What I am planning will end Vortex Corp. Permanently, and it will end Mark Sterling's career in the same movement." She held his gaze. "Tell me." "Vortex Corp is currently in the process of acquiring 3 mid-sized logistics firms," he said, including, as of last week, the announcement of their merger with Streamline. He let that land. Let her absorb the specific shape of it. Mark merging with the company whose stolen strategies had built him, merging it into the very firm that had used those strategies to destroy Julian's empire. Once that merger is complete, Vortex becomes the largest private logistics operator in the country. They will be too big to touch, too embedded, too connected, too complex to unwind. "When does the merger close?" she asked. 90 days. She absorbed that. 90 days. Not a lot of time. Not a little. Exactly enough, maybe, if the right person moved fast. "What do you need from me?" she said. "The original documentation," he said, "the source files, anything that can establish your authorship of both the retention model and the expansion strategy, time-stamped originals, creation metadata, anything we can put in front of a forensic analyst who can testify to their origin." "I have them," she said immediately, "everything. I am meticulous about documentation. The original files are still in my personal cloud system, the same one Mark accessed through the home network. I never deleted anything. I never touched those files after I built them." She paused. "Because some part of me knew, some part of me always knew, that one day I would need to be able to prove what I had built." Julian was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had caught last night when she first mentioned Vortex, that focused, recalibrated look, like a man watching a chessboard rearrange itself into a position he had not expected but immediately recognized as superior. "I need a partner," he said, "not an employee, not a consultant, a partner. Someone who is inside this from the beginning, with full ownership of what we build and what we dismantle." He reached into the folder on the table beside him. She had not noticed it until now, and slid a single sheet of paper toward her. "I drew this up this morning, before breakfast, before I knew everything you just told me." She looked at the paper. It was a simple 1-page document, a partnership structure. Her name was already on it. Julian Thorne, Barl Vance, Phoenix Holdings, LLC. She looked up at him. "You wrote this before we talked this morning?" I wrote it last night, he said, after you went upstairs. She stared at him. You don't know me. I know your work, he said, for the third time. But this time it landed differently, with the weight of everything she had just laid on the table between them, with the full context of what her work actually meant, how far it had traveled without her name on it, how much it had been worth to the people who had taken it. And I know that the person who built what you built, and survived what you survived, and walked into my house last night with nothing and a 4-page strategy by 5 in the morning, that is not a person I can afford to approach slowly. Barl sat with that for a moment. She looked at the paper. She thought about 90 days. She thought about Mark Sterling standing in a boardroom somewhere right now, perfectly comfortable, perfectly confident, completely certain that the woman he had erased would stay erased. She thought about Gerald Voss, about a phone call through an open study door. She doesn't know anything. She never does. She picked up the pen Julian had placed beside the document. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. She signed. Julian took the paper, looked at her signature, set it carefully aside. Welcome to Phoenix Holdings, he said quietly. When do we start? She said. We already have, he said. I made 2 calls this morning. The first was to my forensic accounting team. The second was to a contact at the FCC who has been watching Vortex's acquisition patterns for 18 months and needs one more piece of documentation to open a formal inquiry. He paused. Your retention model. If we can establish your authorship and trace it to Vortex's use in Meridian's collapse, that may be the piece. She absorbed this. There's something else, she said slowly. Something I didn't put in the notes. Julian waited. The Streamline Client Database, she said. The one that went live in 2020. The architecture of that database was mine. I designed the data classification system personally, and I embedded something in it. Not maliciously, not intentionally as a trap, just as a habit. I always embed a signature in systems I build, a small, invisible structural pattern, like a watermark. If you know what to look for, you can see it. If you don't know it's there, you will never find it. Julian was extremely still. And if that signature appears in Vortex's current operating system, then it proves their system was built on mine, she said. Not inspired by, built on, directly. The quiet in the room was the kind of quiet that precedes something enormous. Julian stood. He crossed to the window. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she watched the tension in his shoulders and understood that she was watching a man who had spent 3 years unable to prove what he knew, suddenly holding the key in his hands. He turned around. Can you access the original system architecture, he said. Today? Yes, she said. Everything is in the cloud account. I can pull it up right now on any device you give me. He walked to the desk in the corner of the room. He came back with a laptop, set it in front of her. Show me. She opened the laptop. She logged in. Her fingers moved fast and certain. This was her territory. This was the deep, familiar landscape of her own best thinking. And within 4 minutes, she had the file structure open on the screen. The original architecture, the design documentation, the signature pattern right there at the base of the classification tree, invisible unless you knew the exact variable string to search for. She turned the laptop toward Julian. He leaned forward, looked at the screen, and Barl watched his face as he read, watched the precise moment when understanding moved through him, clean and fast and irreversible, like a key turning in a lock. He pulled back. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He dialed. It rang twice. Marcus, he said when someone picked up, I need you here by noon. Clear everything. He paused. Yes, all of it. Bring the Meridian files. Another pause. Because we found the source. He looked at Barl across the table. Her name is Barl Vance, and she built everything. He hung up. Barl's phone buzzed. She glanced at it automatically, the way you do when you have spent years being expected to respond immediately. A name on the screen stopped her cold. Mark. Not a message this time. A call. She looked at it. Julian looked at it. Neither of them spoke for a second. Then Julian said, very carefully, "You don't have to answer that." "I know," she said, and she let it ring. She let it ring all the way through to voicemail, and she set the phone face down on the table, and she looked at Julian Thorne and said, "Tell me about Marcus." Julian almost smiled. "My legal strategist," he said. "He is the best in the country at what he does, which is building cases that look, right up until the moment they close, like they are going to lose." He picked up his coffee cup. "He is also the person who will understand immediately what your signature pattern means, because he has been looking for something exactly like it for 2.5 years. Barl's phone buzzed again. A voicemail notification. She did not touch it. "Mark is going to realize something is wrong," she said, "when the documentation starts moving, when people start asking questions. He has connections, legal, financial, social. He will fight." "He will," Julian agreed, "loudly, expensively, and badly. Because men like Mark Sterling have never had to fight for anything from a position of actual disadvantage. They do not know how to do it. They mistake aggression for strategy." He looked at her. "You, on the other hand, have been fighting from a position of disadvantage your entire career, which means when he comes at us, and he will, you will already know every move he is going to make before he makes it." She thought about that. She thought about the 12 years she had spent watching Mark operate, every tactic, every deflection, every way he charmed rooms and manipulated narratives and made himself the center of any story. She had studied him without meaning to, in the way you study anyone you live beside for a long time. She knew how he moved under pressure. She knew where he was weakest. She looked at Julian. "He is going to try to go to the press first," she said. "The moment he feels threatened, he will get ahead of the story. He has a relationship at Forbes and 2 contacts at the Wall Street Journal. He will frame whatever happens as a disgruntled ex-wife running a smear campaign." "Let him," Julian said simply. "By the time he does that, we will already have Marcus's brief filed with 3 separate regulatory bodies. Your ownership of the source material established through forensic authentication and..." He paused, and something in his expression shifted to something Barl had not seen there yet, a quiet, cold, absolute certainty. A very public announcement of Phoenix Holdings' position in the market, with your name at the top. She absorbed that. "You want to go public with the company." "I want to go public with you," he said. "There is a difference. The company is leverage. You are the story, the woman who built the foundation of Streamline Logistics, whose work was appropriated, whose contribution was erased, who walked out of a courthouse with nothing and rebuilt in 90 days. He held her gaze. "That is not just a business narrative. That is the kind of story that changes how every boardroom in this country looks at who is actually building what." Barl sat with his words. She felt them land in layers. The practical layer, the strategy, the narrative, the mechanics of the public-facing plan. And then the layer underneath, the one she was not sure she was ready for. The idea that the thing she had been most ashamed of, the invisibility, the erasure, the years of work that had disappeared into other people's credit, that those things were not her failure. They were her evidence. Her phone buzzed a 3rd time. A text now from a number she did not immediately recognize. She picked it up, read it. "This is Gerald Voss. I think you and I should talk before things get complicated. I know about last night. I know where you are. Call me." The temperature of the room seemed to change. She looked up slowly. Julian was watching her face. He read something in it immediately. "What?" he said. She turned the phone around and held the screen toward him. She watched him read the text. She watched something she had not seen in him before move across his features. Not fear, nothing that soft, but something in the same neighborhood. A sharpening, a closing of ranks. He looked up at her. "Gerald Voss just told you he knows you're here," he said. "Yes," she said. "That means someone in my household is communicating with him," Julian said. His voice was completely controlled, but just beneath the surface of it, something was moving fast. "Or he has access to a tracking mechanism on your phone." She had not considered the phone. Her hand tightened around it. "If it's the phone," she said, "then he knows everything we just said. This morning. Everything." Julian stood. He took 3 steps to the window, looked out, looked back. "Does it change anything?" he said. She thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not the fear version, the strategy version. She ran through what Voss knew, what he could do with it, what his warning meant. He had not threatened her. He had said talk before things get complicated, which meant he was not certain of his position, which meant he was worried. "No," she said, "it doesn't change anything. Because if he wanted to shut this down, he would not have texted me. He would have moved on the documentation already. He is trying to scare me." She looked at Julian steadily. "He doesn't know he picked the wrong morning." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and then, quietly, he said, "No, he absolutely does not." She set the phone down. She looked at the partnership document on the table, her signature still fresh on it. She looked at the laptop screen with her life's work laid out in clean architectural lines, timestamps intact, authorship unquestionable. Then she looked at Julian Thorne, who was standing in the morning light, looking at her like she was the most important variable in an equation he had been trying to solve for years. And she thought, 90 days. Mark Sterling had 90 days before his merger closed, and everything he had built on stolen ground became permanent. 90 days before Gerald Voss and Vortex Corp became too large to reach. She had never needed more than she needed right now. She pulled the laptop back toward her. She opened a new document. She started to type. "What are you doing?" Julian asked. "Starting the brief," she said, without looking up. "If Marcus is here at noon, I want to have the first section done before he walks in." She typed fast, the way she always typed when something real was moving through her. "I'm not walking into that meeting empty-handed." Julian was quiet for a moment. Then she heard his chair pull out. She heard him sit down across from her. She heard the sound of him opening his own laptop. "Framework first," he said, "then timeline, then exposure points." "Agreed," she said. And they worked. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday morning, completely unaware that in a house on Fairview, 2 people were quietly building the thing that would, in 90 days, change everything. Barl Vance typed and did not stop, and with every line she wrote, something that had been dead inside her for a very long time came back, clean and furious and absolutely alive. Marcus Webb arrived at 11:47, 13 minutes early, which Julian told Barl was the most punctual the man had ever been in 15 years of working together, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously Julian had framed the call. Marcus was not what she expected. She'd been picturing someone polished, corporate, a man in a $6,000 suit who spoke in careful legal language and made you feel like every sentence was billable. What walked through the front door was a compact, sharp-eyed man in his late 40s, wearing a rumpled jacket and carrying a leather bag so overstuffed it could barely close. He had the look of someone who had not slept well in several years and had made his peace with it. He looked at Barl the moment he entered the room, not at Julian, at Barl. And his first words to her were, "Show me the signature pattern." No hello, no introduction. Julian had told him, and Marcus had arrived already in motion. She turned the laptop toward him. He sat down without being invited, pulled the bag onto his lap, and stared at the screen with the focused intensity of a man diffusing something. 30 seconds passed. 45. A full minute of silence while Barl and Julian watched him read. Then Marcus said, very quietly, "This is it." Julian said nothing. He was watching Marcus the way you watch a doctor reading a scan, waiting for the confirmation of what you already suspected, but needed someone else to say out loud. "This is exactly the structure we found in Meridian's operating backbone," Marcus said. He pulled a folder from his bag and opened it on the table, spreading pages that were dense with technical notations and highlighted strings of code. Here, and here, the classification variable, the branching logic in the attrition model, it is structurally identical, not similar, identical. He looked up at Barl. Did you use a standard development template when you built this? No, she said. Everything was original. I built the classification tree from scratch because the standard templates couldn't handle the multivariable weighting I needed. The branching logic is a solution I developed specifically for a problem I couldn't find an existing answer to. So there is no plausible independent development argument, Marcus said. None, she said. What I built was a response to a specific operational problem at Streamline. Vortex would have had no reason to develop this structure independently because they were not facing the same operational problem. The only way they have this is if someone handed it to them. Marcus closed the folder. He looked at Julian. When did you say the merger closes? 90 days, Julian said. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a laugh. We need 60. Maybe 55 if the forensic authentication moves fast. I can have the regulatory brief filed in 2 weeks if she gives me everything. He turned back to Barl. Everything. Original creation timestamps, cloud access logs, any internal communications where you referenced this work, any drafts, any version history, every single digital footprint that puts your name on this before anyone else's. I have all of it, she said. Good. He pulled out a legal pad. Start from the beginning, the first day you opened this file. I need the full timeline in your own words before we touch any documentation. She started talking. For the next hour and 40 minutes, Barl Vance laid out the complete history of her work at Streamline with a precision and detail that visibly impressed even Marcus Webb, who had the manner of a man who was not easily impressed by anything. She gave him dates, file names, version numbers, the specific conversations, and the conspicuous absences of conversations that traced the arc of her contribution from invisible labor to documented intellectual property. She told him about the 2 times she had accessed her personal system from the home network. She told him about Gerald Voss. She told him about the voicemail she still had not listened to from Mark, and the text from a number she now assumed was Voss himself. When she mentioned the text, Marcus put down his pen. "He texted you this morning?" he said. "Just before 9, she said. From what number?" She read it off her phone. Marcus took out his own phone and typed it in without explanation. He did not tell her what he was doing, and she did not ask. She had already learned, in less than 2 hours of sitting across from this man, that Marcus Webb operated in a state of perpetual parallel processing. He was always running 3 things at once, and the things he did not explain were usually the most important. Julian refilled everyone's coffee. He had been largely quiet through the session, listening with the focused attention of someone absorbing information they planned to use precisely. Occasionally, he asked a clarifying question, a name, a date, a specific financial figure, but mostly he let Barl and Marcus work, which Barl appreciated more than she could say. She had spent 12 years in rooms where the most qualified person was also the least allowed to speak. Being given the floor and left on it felt, still, slightly disorienting, like a muscle that had been held in tension for so long that relaxing it was almost painful. It was just past 1 in the afternoon when Marcus set down his pen for the second time, leaned back, and said, "Here is where we are." Both of them looked at him. "The forensic authentication is straightforward," he said. "Your documentation is clean. Your timestamps are verifiable through the cloud provider's server logs, which are subpoena-proof. The signature pattern is the centerpiece. It is the kind of evidence that does not require interpretation. It either matches or it doesn't. And it matches." He paused. "The harder problem is not proving that your work was taken. The harder problem is proving the chain of custody. Who took it, when, and how it moved from your personal system to Vortex's infrastructure." "Mark," Barl said simply. "Mark is the obvious answer," Marcus said, "and obvious answers get challenged. We need the chain documented, which means we need to know how the information physically moved." He looked at Julian. "The access log from her home network. Can we get that?" "The account is in her name," Julian said, looking at Barl. "It was in my name," she corrected carefully, "until yesterday, when my access to everything connected to that address was formally removed as part of the settlement." The table went quiet. Marcus's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes recalibrated fast. "The settlement," he said. "Who drafted it?" "His team," she said. "My attorney reviewed it. She told me I had grounds for more, but I signed quickly because I wanted it over." Marcus was already opening the folder again. "I need to see that settlement document," he said. "Today." "Why?" Julian asked. "Because if his legal team structured the settlement to include the removal of her network access credentials," Marcus said, his voice dropping half a register, "that was not standard divorce procedure. That was protective removal of evidence." He looked at Barl. "They knew what was on that network, and they moved to cut you off from it before you thought to look." The silence in the room had weight. Barl sat with that. She sat with the precise, specific shape of it. The settlement terms she had signed without reading carefully enough, the network credentials she had not thought to copy, the meticulous thoroughness of a legal team that had been protecting something far more valuable than a real estate asset. She had been too exhausted, too heartbroken, too desperate for it to be over. And they had known she would be. They had counted on it. Her hands were flat on the table. She made a conscious decision to keep them still. "I have a copy of the settlement on my phone," she said, her voice completely even. "My attorney emailed it to me yesterday afternoon." "Forward it to me right now," Marcus said. He gave her the address. She sent it. He opened his phone, read for approximately 90 seconds, and then said one word: "Deliberate." "What specifically?" Julian said. "Section 4, subsection C," Marcus said. "The Network Access Clause. It is written in the language of standard property division, but it is structured as a comprehensive digital access revocation. It covers not just the home network, but any cloud-connected service accessed from that address in the previous 5 years." He looked up. "That is not boilerplate. Someone wrote that clause specifically. Someone who knew exactly which access logs existed and wanted them legally inaccessible to her." Barl felt something cold move through her. Not fear, not even anger, just the clean, clarifying sensation of understanding something completely. "They thought I didn't know what was in my own system," she said. "They thought cutting off my access would cut off my evidence." "Yes," Marcus said, "but they made a mistake." "What mistake?" she said. "They wrote the clause to cover access from that address," he said, "not ownership of the files themselves. Your personal cloud account, the one where the original files live, that account is yours. The files are yours. The access revocation only covers the network portal. The data itself was never part of the settlement because they apparently did not know it was stored separately from the home system." Barl stared at him. "They thought my personal cloud account was part of the home network. They thought you stored everything in one place," Marcus said, "because most people do." He looked at her. "But you didn't." She almost laughed. 8 years of professional caution, 8 years of keeping her best work in a separate, private system because she had learned the hard way that ideas in shared spaces had a way of losing their original owners. 8 years of protecting her work out of professional habit, not foresight, not legal strategy, just the quiet, persistent self-preservation of a woman who had learned not to trust the spaces she shared. It had saved everything. "So we have the files," Julian said. "We have the files," Marcus confirmed. "And with the forensic authentication, we have the authorship. Now we need the chain." He paused. "Gerald Voss." At the name, both Barl and Julian went still simultaneously, Marcus noticed. His eyes moved between them. "He texted her this morning," Julian said. "He said he knows she's here. He wants to talk before things get complicated." Marcus was quiet for 4 full seconds, which, Barl was already learning, was a long time for Marcus Webb. "He's running scared," Marcus said finally. "If Voss is reaching out directly, that means someone on his side knows that the merger timeline is at risk, and they don't know exactly what we have. They know something is moving. They don't know how much." "How would he know she's here?" Barl asked. "Here, specifically." Marcus looked at Julian. Julian's jaw tightened. "I've been running a reduced staff this week," he said carefully. 2 people in the house, Mrs. Pierce, who has been with me for 11 years, and a temporary hire who started Monday. The room was quiet for a half second. Monday, Marcus said. Yes, Julian said, and the single syllable had a cold, controlled edge to it that Barl had not heard in his voice before, which would be the day before Barl arrived. Marcus was already on his phone. He stepped away from the table, speaking quietly and quickly into the device, and Barl looked at Julian and said, in an equally quiet voice, "They planted someone." "It appears so," Julian said. His voice was level, but she could see, in the slight tightening around his eyes, that this was not a small thing for him. This was a violation of a space he had spent years protecting. Julian Thorne was a reclusive man. His home was his sanctuary. Someone had reached inside it. "Julian," she said, "how long have you been planning this, the move against Vortex, before I showed up?" He looked at her. A pause that was just a beat too long. 3 years, he said. "I have been building the financial architecture for 3 years. I had the funding, the legal groundwork, the market positioning. What I did not have was the evidence, the one piece that would transform a civil case into something that could actually end them rather than just inconvenience them. The source documentation," she said. "Yes," he said, and then, quietly, "I did not expect to find it by opening my front door in the rain." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in the way he said it, not sentimentally, not as a performance, just as a plain statement of an unexpected fact that landed in her chest somewhere she was not prepared for. She moved past it deliberately, the way you move past a window in a burning building. There was work to do. Marcus came back to the table. "The temporary hire," he said. "He left the property at 8 this morning, did not return. Julian's security team is pulling the access logs." Julian nodded once, said nothing. "Here is what I think happened," Marcus said. He sat back down. He had the manner now of a man who had moved from analysis to strategy, and the shift in his energy was palpable. Voss has been monitoring Julian's activity for the same reason Julian has been monitoring his, because they both know a confrontation is coming. When Barl walked through that door last night, someone reported it. When Julian made 2 calls this morning, someone noted the timing. Voss is not certain what we have, but he is certain enough to reach out. He looked at Barl. "The question is what you do with the text." "I don't respond," she said immediately. "That is one option," Marcus said. "The other option is more aggressive." She waited. "You respond," Marcus said. "You agree to meet, and you use that meeting to understand exactly how much Voss knows and how much of it he is willing to say out loud in a room where we can document it." Julian said, "That puts her directly in his line of sight." "She is already in his line of sight," Marcus said flatly. "That text this morning confirmed it. The question is whether she is in his line of sight as a target or as a player." He looked at Barl. "There is a significant difference." She understood the difference. She had navigated that difference for 12 years in every professional room she had ever entered. She knew better than almost anyone what it meant to be in a room where people were deciding what category to put you in: target or threat, peripheral or central, erasable or essential. She had spent a career trying to get people to see her correctly. She was done with that strategy. "Set the meeting," she said, "but on my terms, my location, my timeline." And Marcus is there, positioned outside with everything recording. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You have done something like this before." "Not exactly like this," she said, "but close enough." He nodded, made a note. "I'll have a proposed framework to you by tonight." It was 3:15 in the afternoon when Marcus Webb packed his bag and left the house, already on 2 calls simultaneously and walking fast. In the quiet after his departure, Barl sat at the table and felt the full accumulated weight of the day pressed down on her for the first time. Not grief. She was past the active phase of that. Something more like exhaustion cut through with something electric. She was tired in her bones and more alive in her mind than she had been in years. Her phone showed 4 missed calls from Mark. 2 from Dana, her college roommate, who had presumably figured out by now that Barl had never arrived. 1 from Sandra Cole, her attorney, and the unread voicemail from this morning, still sitting there like an unexploded device. She looked at it. Then she pressed play. Mark's voice filled the air close to her ear, and even now, even after everything, the familiarity of it was a small, private gut punch. He sounded controlled, professionally warm in the particular way he deployed warmth when he wanted something. "Barl, I heard you didn't make it to Dana's last night. Look, I know yesterday was hard. I know the way things ended was rough. I want to make sure you're okay. We're not enemies here. Call me back. Let's talk like adults." She played it a second time. She listened differently the second time, not to the words, but to the spaces between them. "I heard you didn't make it to Dana's." He knew she had not arrived at Dana's apartment. He had someone watching. The call was not concern. The call was reconnaissance. She deleted the voicemail. She set the phone down and looked at the wall for a moment. Julian came back into the room. He had been somewhere in the house dealing with the security situation, and he stopped when he saw her face. "The voicemail," she said, "from Mark. He knew I didn't make it to my friend's apartment last night." Julian sat down. "Then the monitoring started before you walked through my door," he said. "He had someone on you from the courthouse." "He wanted to know where I went," she said. "He was worried about what I might do." She paused, which means he was already worried, even before he knew I was here, even before Voss texted this morning. "He has been afraid of me since before I signed those papers." She looked at Julian. "What does that tell you?" Julian's expression was steady and cold and certain. "It tells me he knows exactly what you built," he said, "and he has always known. The indifference, the erasure, the clean and brutal exit. It was not carelessness. It was management. He was managing the risk of you." He met her eyes, and he miscalculated. She sat with that for a long moment. She thought about 12 years through the lens of that single reframe, and the picture it produced was almost too large to hold. Every dismissal, every overlooked contribution, every meeting where her ideas were absorbed and rebranded. Not just thoughtlessness, management, deliberate, ongoing, strategic suppression of a threat he could not afford to acknowledge, but could not afford to let grow. He had known the whole time. She stood up. The movement was sudden and decisive, and Julian looked at her with a slight shift of attention. "I need to call Dana," she said. "She's been trying to reach me, and she deserves to know I'm safe." She paused. "And then I need to know everything about the Global Tech Summit." Julian blinked, just slightly. "The summit is in 42 days, he said. "I know," she said. "Marcus said we need 55 days minimum for the regulatory brief. That's too late for the summit." "Yes," Julian said carefully. "Then we need it in 40, she said. "Can Marcus move in 40 days? A pause. Julian looked at her with that recalibrated expression, the one she was starting to recognize as his version of being caught off guard, which in his case looked like almost nothing on the surface and a great deal happening underneath. 40 days is aggressive, he said. 40 days is necessary, she said, because Mark will be at that summit. He is presenting the Vortex merger as a keynote. I have seen the promotional materials. They were in the Forbes piece he mentioned in his text. He is planning to stand on a stage in front of every major player in this industry and announce the biggest consolidation in logistics in a decade. She looked at Julian directly. I want to be in that room. Julian was quiet. Not as his ex-wife, she said, as the CEO of Phoenix Holdings, as the woman who is filing the regulatory brief that puts his entire merger at risk, as the person he spent 12 years trying to manage and failed. She held his gaze. I want him to look up from that podium and see my face. The silence stretched. Then Julian said, 40 days. 40 days, she confirmed. He reached for his phone. I'll call Marcus. She walked out of the room to call Dana, and in the hallway, with the afternoon light coming through the tall windows, she felt something settle into place inside her that had no precise name. It was not revenge. She had examined the feeling carefully enough to know that revenge was too small a word for it, too hot and too personal. It was something more architectural than that. The feeling of looking at a structure that had been built to contain you, and understanding for the first time exactly where the load-bearing walls were. Mark Sterling had spent 12 years managing her as a risk. He had underestimated the risk. He had failed to manage it cleanly enough, quickly enough, completely enough. He had left evidence. He had left a cloud account. He had left a signature pattern embedded in a system he had sold to the wrong people. And he had left her alive and functional and angrier than he had apparently calculated. Dana picked up on the second ring. "Barl, oh thank God, where are you? I have been calling since last night." "I'm safe," Barl said. "I'm somewhere safe. I can't explain everything yet, but I need you to know I'm okay." She paused. "I'm better than okay, Dana. I think I'm actually okay, for the first time in a long time." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound different." "I am different," Barl said simply, and she meant it. She hung up. She walked back toward the study, toward Julian Thorne and the work that was waiting, toward 40 days that were going to require everything she had ever been and everything she had been prevented from becoming. Down the hall, she could hear Julian on the phone with Marcus. She heard him say, simply, firmly, without hesitation, "40 days, Marcus. Make it work." And then she heard Marcus say something she could not make out, and Julian say, in the voice of a man who had already decided, "Because she needs 40, so we do 40. She stood in the hallway and breathed. Outside, somewhere across the city, Mark Sterling was probably in a meeting, probably in a room full of people who treated him like he had built something, probably completely comfortable, completely confident. 42 days away from the biggest announcement of his career. He had no idea what was coming. Neither, truly, did she. Not the full shape of it, not every obstacle and reversal and moment of doubt that the next 40 days would bring. But she knew this. She was no longer the woman standing in the rain outside a courthouse, holding a phone with 4 sentences on it, trying to remember how to breathe. She was something else now. She walked back into the study, sat down across from Julian's empty chair, and opened the laptop. She got back to work. The meeting with Gerald Voss happened on day 6. Marcus had spent 4 days preparing it, which, in Marcus Webb's professional vocabulary, meant he had been awake for most of those 4 days, building a legal container so precise and so thoroughly documented that anything Voss said inside it would have the structural integrity of a signed confession. He had chosen a hotel conference room on neutral ground, not Julian's house, not anywhere connected to Phoenix Holdings, not anywhere that Voss could later claim had been engineered to his disadvantage. Clean ground, public enough to feel safe, private enough to be real. Barl had spent those same 4 days doing 2 things simultaneously. During the day, she worked with Marcus on the regulatory brief, filling in timeline gaps, pulling original files, walking his forensic team through the signature pattern with a technical precision that had made the lead analyst stop and say, quietly, "You actually built this from scratch, didn't you?" Not a question, a recognition. She had nodded and said yes, and the analyst had looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has just recalibrated their understanding of a situation entirely. At night, she prepared for Voss. She sat with what she knew about him and built a psychological map the way she built every other kind of map, methodically, from the edges in. Gerald Voss was a man who operated in the spaces between legality. He was not a criminal in the conventional sense. He was the kind of man who never personally touched anything that could be traced, who always had 3 layers of insulation between himself and the action, who had survived 20 years in the gray margins of corporate acquisition by being the person who created the conditions rather than the person who pulled the trigger. He was careful. He was controlled. And he had made one mistake. He had texted her directly. That meant he was rattled. Rattled men talk. The morning of the meeting, Julian found her in the kitchen at 6:15, already dressed, already on her second coffee, already with the notepad in front of her. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the past several days, with that particular quality of attention she had stopped trying to categorize and started simply accepting. It was the look of a man watching someone operate at their best and recognizing it as exactly that. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Ready," she said, which was the truth. She had moved through nervousness 2 days ago and come out the other side into something cleaner. Clarity. Focus. The specific calm of a person who has identified exactly what they are walking into and made their peace with all possible outcomes. Julian poured his coffee and sat across from her. "Marcus called at 5:30, he said. "The forensic authentication came back overnight. Complete confirmation. Your signature pattern is present in Vortex's current operating system in 14 distinct locations. The analyst is willing to testify." She put down her coffee cup. 14 locations, she said. 14, he confirmed. They didn't just use your model. They built their entire operational backbone on it. Every acquisition they have made in the last 4 years runs on infrastructure derived from your original design. The number sat between them with the weight of everything it meant. Not just Streamline, not just Meridian. Every company Vortex Corp had consumed in 4 years had been consumed using tools stolen from a woman who had been sitting in a courtroom 6 days ago with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered marriage. "Julian," she said carefully, "what is the current market valuation of Vortex Corp?" He met her eyes. "As of yesterday's close," he said, $4.7 billion. She was quiet for a moment. "Built on my work," she said. "Built on your work," he confirmed. She picked up the coffee cup again. Her hand was completely steady. "Then let's go make sure Gerald Voss understands the position he is in," she said. The hotel conference room was on the 14th floor. Marcus was already there when they arrived, positioned at the far end, with a legal pad and an expression of professional neutrality that Barl had come to understand meant he was operating at maximum intensity. Julian sat to her left. The recording equipment was invisible and already running. Voss arrived 4 minutes late, which Barl read immediately as a small dominance play, late enough to signal he was not anxious, not late enough to be disrespectful. He was a tall man, 60s, silver-haired, with the particular kind of fitness that money buys. Not athletic exactly, but maintained, controlled. He came in alone, which surprised her. She had expected an attorney. He sat down across from them and looked at Barl for a long moment. Not at Julian, at Barl. And his first words were, "You look better than I expected, given the week you've had." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "You look exactly as I expected." Something shifted in his eyes. He had expected grief. He had expected desperation or anger or the brittle composure of someone holding themselves together with both hands. He had not expected this. A woman sitting across from him with the calm, centered energy of someone who had already won the argument and was simply waiting for the other person to figure it out. He looked at Julian. "Julian Thorne," he said, "you've been quiet for a long time." "I have," Julian said. "I find silence useful. People fill it." Voss smiled thinly. He looked back at Barl. "I assume you brought legal," he said, glancing at Marcus. "Marcus Webb," Marcus said from the end of the table, not looking up from his legal pad. "And yes." Voss folded his hands on the table. He was composing himself. She could see it happening. The slight reset of his shoulders, the deliberate relaxation of his jaw. "I came here because I think there are some misunderstandings that could be resolved quietly," he said, "before anyone does anything they cannot undo." "I agree completely," Barl said. "Why don't you start by telling me how my client retention model ended up in Meridian Logistics' operating backbone?" The silence was about 2 seconds long, short enough that someone not paying attention might have missed it. Barl was paying close attention. "I don't know what you're referring to," Voss said. "Then I'll be specific," she said. She slid a single page across the table, a clean, one-paragraph summary Marcus had prepared. No technical jargon, just the essential finding stated plainly. Vance looked at it. She watched him read. She watched him read it a second time, slower. She watched the controlled, silver-haired composure hold, mostly. 14 instances, she said. Our forensic analysts can testify to each one. The creation timestamps on my original files predate your first acquisition by 3 years. Vance looked up from the page. He was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "What do you want?" She had known that would be the first real question. Men like Vance moved fast to transaction once the pretense was punctured. "What I want," she said, "is what was taken from me. My intellectual property, my professional credit, my contribution to every company that has operated on infrastructure I built." She paused. "And I want the streamline merger stopped." He laughed. It was a short, hard sound with no warmth in it. "The merger closes in 84 days. You cannot stop it in 84 days. "We have 40, Marcus said from the end of the table, still not looking up. "No regulatory body moves in 40 days, Vance said. "They do when the documentation is this complete," Marcus said. He finally looked up. He held Vance's gaze with the steady, unhurried confidence of a man who had been in worse rooms than this and walked out of all of them. "And when 3 separate federal inquiries are initiated simultaneously, which is what we are filing next week." Vance's jaw tightened. He looked back at Barl. "You are making a mistake," he said. His voice had dropped half a register. The pleasantness was gone now. "You don't understand who you are dealing with." "I think I do," she said. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his face, and she did not flinch. "I am dealing with a man who built a $4.7 billion company on intellectual property he did not own, using a business model that belongs to me, and who has spent 4 years hoping the person he stole it from would be too broken, too invisible, or too afraid to come looking." She leaned forward slightly. "I am not broken. I am not invisible. And I am absolutely not afraid." The room was very quiet. Vance looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Julian. Something passed between the two men. A look with history in it, something old and mutual and hard. "This is your play," Vance said to Julian. "You've been building to this." "She is not my play," Julian said quietly. "She is her own." Vance stood. He straightened his jacket with deliberate composure. "My legal team will be in touch," he said. "We look forward to it," Marcus said. He left. The door closed behind him. The room held its silence for exactly 3 seconds, and then Marcus Webb set down his pen and said, "That went better than I expected." "Did he say anything useful?" Julian asked. "He said enough," Barl said. She was looking at the door Vance had just walked through. "He asked what I wanted before he denied anything. That sequence matters legally. And he did not deny the technical findings." She looked at Marcus. "He cannot deny them." "No," Marcus said, "he can't." He picked up his phone. "I'm calling the regulatory team. We move the filing up to Monday." That was day 6. Day 6 of 40. The days that followed moved at a pace Barl had never experienced before. Not the slow, grinding pace of a dying marriage, not the artificial urgency of corporate deadlines she had manufactured for other people. This was something different, something real and fast and entirely her own. She was working 12 to 14 hours a day, and the work felt like breathing, natural, necessary, the thing her lungs were built for. On day 11, the forensic report was finalized and signed. 14 instances, 3 analysts, unimpeachable. On day 14, Marcus filed the first regulatory brief. By the end of that day, 2 federal bodies had acknowledged receipt and 1 had initiated a preliminary inquiry. Marcus called from his car to tell her, and she was already on the phone with Julian before Marcus had finished his sentence. On day 17, the Wall Street Journal ran a small item, 3rd page of the business section, noting that Vortex Corp's merger timeline was facing regulatory scrutiny. The item was bland and careful and said almost nothing. It did not matter. In the world of corporate acquisition, a whisper in the Wall Street Journal traveled faster than a headline anywhere else. On day 18, Mark Sterling called for the 5th time. She did not answer. On day 19, he called Sandra Cole instead. Sandra called Barl. "He wants to know if you're involved in the Vortex inquiry," Sandra said. And Barl could hear the particular, careful neutrality of an attorney trying not to editorialize. "What did you tell him?" Barl asked. "I told him I couldn't speak to my client's activities," Sandra said. And then, after a pause, "Barl, what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago," Barl said. "I'll be in touch, Sandra." On day 22, Gerald Voss filed a counter-motion, attempting to challenge the admissibility of the forensic documentation on procedural grounds. Marcus received the filing, read it in 40 minutes, and called Barl with a tone she had not heard from him before. Something that, in a less contained man, would have been delight. "They are using the settlement's network access clause to argue that the documentation was obtained in violation of the terms," he said. "They are arguing that your personal cloud account was implicitly covered by the access revocation." "But it wasn't," she said. "You said yourself the clause only covered network access from the home address." "Correct," Marcus said, "which means their motion will fail. But here is what matters. They filed it. They are in the system now, arguing about the documentation in a proceeding where the documentation is already submitted. Every motion they file from this point is an admission that the documentation is real." She understood immediately. "They're proving our case for us," she said. "Every time they fight the wrong thing," Marcus said. "Yes." It was on day 27 that the first major twist arrived, and it arrived in a form nobody had anticipated. It was past 10 at night. Julie and Barl were still in the study. This had become their rhythm, the two of them working late into the evening, the house quiet around them, the work between them the specific kind of productive that feels like something being built in real time. Julian was on a call. Barl was reviewing a financial projection Marcus had sent over. She was tired, but the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from exerting yourself in the right direction. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Then something, the same instinct that had made her keep her work files separate from the home network, the same quiet, persistent self-preservation, made her answer. The voice on the other end was a woman's, low, careful, speaking quickly. "Ms. Vance, my name is Carol Reyes. I was the CFO of Meridian Logistics until the company collapsed in 2021. A pause. "I know what happened to your work. I have documentation you do not have, and I have been waiting for someone to be in a position to use it." Barl went completely still. Julian looked up from his call. Something in her face made him end his call immediately and put his phone down. "What kind of documentation?" Barl said carefully. "Internal emails," Carol said, "from Vortex's executive team dated 2020. They discuss the acquisition of the Streamline strategy by name. They reference the source as a confidential internal transfer arranged by a Streamline board member." She paused. "The name in those emails is Mark Sterling." The sound in the room was just Barl's own breathing. "Why are you coming forward now?" she asked. "Because I lost my career," Carol said. "My team, my people, 43 employees who trusted me to protect the company. And I have been carrying this documentation for 2 years, waiting for someone with the resources and the legal structure to actually use it. When I saw the Wall Street Journal item," another pause, "I did the math." Barl looked at Julian. He was watching her with absolute focus. "Can you come in person?" Barl said. "I can come tomorrow," Carol said, "if you have legal on site." "We do," Barl said. 9 in the morning. She hung up. Julian said, "What was that?" "The chain of custody," she said. "The piece Marcus said we needed, the link between Mark and Vortex that we couldn't prove." She set the phone down. Her hand was completely steady, and her heart was going very fast, and she was thinking of 14 instances and $4.7 billion and 43 employees at a company called Meridian who had trusted someone to protect them. It just walked through the door. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Call Marcus." "It's 10:15, she said. "Call Marcus," he said again. She called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, fully alert, which told her he had still been awake. She told him in 3 sentences. There was a silence on his end that she had learned to read as the sound of his mind moving very fast. Then he said, 9 in the morning, I will be there at 8. Carol Reyes arrived the next morning with a folder and a portable drive and the specific, composed expression of a woman who had been living with a secret for 2 years and had made her peace with whatever the act of releasing it was going to cost her. She was in her early 50s, direct, technical in her speech, completely credible. She sat across from Marcus and laid everything on the table, in the same way Barl had laid everything on the table 9 days ago, methodically, from the earliest point to the most recent, with the clear, detailed memory of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. The emails were exactly what she had described. 6 internal vortex communications from 2020 involving 3 senior executives and 1 external party. The external party was referred to by initials in most messages. In one message near the bottom of the chain, someone had gotten careless and used the full name, Mark Sterling. Marcus read that email, read it again, set the folder down on the table with a quietness that was louder than any exclamation. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "are these the originals?" "The originals are on the drive," she said. "What you have in the folder are certified copies. The originals have been in a bank deposit box since February 2022. "Did anyone know you had them?" "My former personal attorney," she said, "and no one else." Marcus looked at Julian. Julian looked at Barl. Barl looked at the folder and thought about Mark Sterling standing in front of a boardroom somewhere, completely comfortable, completely confident, managing his risks. She thought about, she doesn't know anything. She never does. She thought about day 28 out of 40. "Ms. Reyes," Barl said, "would you be willing to testify?" Carol Reyes looked at her steadily. "That is why I'm here," she said. The next 12 days were the hardest, not because the work was failing. The work was succeeding, faster and more completely than even Marcus had projected in his most optimistic framework. The second regulatory body opened a formal investigation on day 31. The forensic report was entered into 3 separate proceedings on day 33. Marcus filed Carol's documentation as supplementary evidence on day 34 and told them that the opposing legal team had gone quiet in a way that, in his experience, preceded either a settlement offer or a complete strategic pivot. The hardest part was the noise. On day 30, the Forbes piece ran. It was everything Mark had promised himself it would be. A glossy, breathless profile of the Vortex merger and Mark Sterling's vision for the future of logistics, complete with a photo of him in a corner office that Barl was fairly certain she had decorated. The article did not mention her name. It did not mention Streamline's origins. It presented Mark Sterling as the sole architect of an industry transformation, a self-made visionary who had built something extraordinary from the ground up. Julian found her reading it at midnight and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Does it still hurt?" She thought about it honestly. "Less than I expected," she said. "Mostly, it just makes me impatient." He sat down beside her, not across from her the way he usually sat when they were working, beside her, close enough that she was aware of him as a person rather than a presence. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she confirmed. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the late house, the Forbes article still open on her laptop screen. And something shifted between them that neither of them named. It had been shifting for days, gradually, incrementally, the way things shift between 2 people who are in close proximity to each other's best and worst selves for long enough. She was aware of it. She suspected he was too. She had made a private, deliberate decision not to address it until the 40 days were done, and she suspected, from the careful, measured distance he maintained in every room they shared, that he had made the same decision. There was a time for that. This was not it. On day 36, Mark Sterling's legal team made contact with Marcus. They wanted to discuss a settlement. Marcus called Barl immediately, and she could hear in his voice that he was working very hard to contain something. "They want a conversation," he said, "off the record. No, she said, without hesitation. Barl, no settlement, she said. Not now, not when we are 4 days out from the summit. He wants to settle because he knows what is coming. He wants to make it quiet and private and contained, and then in 2 years he will rebuild quietly from somewhere else and do this to someone else. Her voice was steady and absolutely certain. No settlement, Marcus. We finish this publicly. A pause. If we go to the summit, it will be very public, Marcus said carefully, and he will fight back in the room, in front of everyone. Good, she said. Let him. Marcus was quiet for 2 seconds, then, I'll tell them no. On day 38, Julian's team confirmed their registration for the Global Tech Summit. 2 seats, Julian Thorne and Barl Vance, representing Phoenix Holdings. The registration was public, the way all summit registrations were public, listed in the event program that went out to every attendee and every press outlet covering the conference. The response was almost immediate. Barl's phone showed a news alert within 3 hours, a small item from a tech industry newsletter. Julian Thorne to make first public appearance in 3 years at Global Tech Summit. Accompanied by Phoenix Holdings co-founder Barl Vance, former Streamline Operations Executive. Former Streamline Operations Executive. She read that phrase twice. She thought about all the meetings she had run that Mark had been credited for. All the strategies she had built that had traveled the world without her name on them. Former Operations Executive. Not even close to the full story. In 2 days, the full story would be on a stage. Her phone rang. Julian, from 2 rooms away. She answered. Did you see it? He asked. I saw it, she said. He will know you're coming, Julian said. I'm counting on it, she said. Let him spend 2 days knowing I'm walking into that room. Let him feel that. She paused. How does it feel, Julian, to know that after 3 years, you're 2 days away? A silence. The honest kind. It feels like something I was not certain I would ever feel, he said. And then, more quietly, it feels better because you are in it. She held the phone and did not say anything for a moment, because the thing she wanted to say was not appropriate to the 40-day framework she had imposed on herself, and she was a woman who kept the commitments she made to herself, even the ones no one else knew about. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he said. On day 39, she could not sleep. She lay in the guest room, which had long since stopped feeling like a guest room and started feeling simply like her room, which was a fact she also filed away for after. And she thought about the courtroom 40 days ago, the beige room, the 4 sentences, the rain, the wrong address, the blown tire, the door opening on a man she had never met who had looked at her like he was expecting her. She thought about 43 employees at Meridian Logistics who had lost their jobs. She thought about Carol Reyes and her bank deposit box and 2 years of waiting. She thought about Marcus Webb and his overstuffed leather bag and his 15 years of working late. She thought about the 14 instances of her signature pattern in a $4.7 billion company's backbone. She thought about Mark Sterling's face when he looked up from that podium tomorrow and saw her in the room. And she thought about Julian's voice on the phone. It feels better because you are in it. She got up. She went to the desk. She opened her laptop. She did not write a strategy this time. She wrote 1 sentence on a blank page, and then she closed the laptop and went back to bed and slept, finally, deeply, all the way through to the morning of day 40. The sentence she had written was this: tomorrow, I stop being invisible. The summit was in 12 hours. She was dressed and downstairs by 6:15. Not because she had slept well. She had slept deeply, which was different. The sleep of a person who had made their decision and stopped second-guessing it. She woke at 5:45 with the particular alertness that comes not from anxiety, but from readiness, the way an athlete wakes on the morning of a competition they have been training for their entire life without knowing it. Mrs. Pierce had coffee waiting. Barl sat at the kitchen table and drank it slowly and went over everything in her mind one final time. Not the strategy, The strategy was Marcus's domain, and it was airtight. What she went over was herself, the internal architecture, the places where she was still tender, and the places where she had become, in 40 days, something harder and more certain. She pressed on each of them deliberately, the way you press a bruise to understand how much it has healed. The divorce, the boxes on the lobby floor, the 4 sentences on a glowing phone screen. She pressed on all of it. And what came back was not grief, not anymore. What came back was information, clean, usable, hers. Julian came downstairs at 6:40. He stopped when he saw her, and she saw him take in the full picture of her. The dark tailored suit she had purchased 2 days ago with the first advance draw from Phoenix Holdings' operating account. Her name on a company card for the first time in her professional life. The absolute stillness in her posture that was the opposite of defeat. He looked at her the way he had looked at her 100 times in 40 days, that focused, recalibrated attention. Except this morning it had something additional in it that he did not try to conceal. "You look like someone who has already won," he said. "I look like someone who did the work," she said. "The winning happens today." He almost smiled. He poured his coffee and sat across from her, and they went over the day's sequence one final time. Marcus would be at the summit venue by 8. Carol Reyes had been confirmed as a credentialed attendee. The Phoenix Holdings registration was visible in the official program, which meant every journalist and industry contact in that building already knew they were coming. The regulatory filings, all 3 of them, were active and documented, which meant that anything Mark said on that stage about the Vortex merger would be said in the context of a public record that contradicted it on every material point. The summit began at 9. Mark's keynote was at 11:30. They had 4 hours and 15 minutes. In the car on the way over, Julian said, "How do you want to do this?" "We go in together," she said. "We are visible from the moment we walk through the door. I want him to know I am in the room before he steps on that stage. I want him to have 45 minutes of knowing." Julian glanced at her. "You want him rattled." "I want him exactly rattled enough to make a mistake," she said. "Not so rattled he walks out. Just rattled enough that when he stands at that podium, he is not fully in control. Because Mark Sterling at full control is dangerous. Mark Sterling slightly off balance is exactly manageable." Julian was quiet for a moment. "You have been thinking about this for 40 days, he said. "I have been thinking about this for 12 years, she said. "I just didn't know what I was preparing for." They arrived at 8:52. The summit was held in a conference center that knew its own importance, the kind of place that hosted the conversations that moved industries. Registration tables staffed by people in matching blazers, attendees in expensive suits, moving with the particular energy of people who were simultaneously networking and being networked at. The air smelled like ambition and decent coffee. Marcus was exactly where he said he would be, standing near the entrance to the main hall with his overstuffed bag and his rumpled jacket, looking like the least impressive person in the building, and being, Barl knew, the most dangerous. He fell into step beside them without preamble. "3 press contacts have already asked about your registration," he said quietly. 2 from trade publications, 1 from Bloomberg. "I told them Phoenix Holdings would be making a statement at the appropriate time." "Good," Barl said. "Sterling's team knows you're here," Marcus continued. "I saw his chief of staff make a call approximately 90 seconds after I entered the building. Someone is watching the door." "Let them watch," Julian said. They moved into the main hall. The effect was subtle but immediate, and Barl felt it clearly. The shift in a crowded room when someone enters it who changes the calculation. Not everyone noticed them, but the right people did. She saw 2 faces she recognized from Streamline's extended orbit, people who had known her as Mark's wife, doing a visible double-take at the Phoenix Holdings badges on their lapels. She saw a woman from a competitor firm she had met 3 years ago at a conference where Barl had been present as a spouse and not as herself. And the woman looked at her badge and then at her face and said, without being able to stop herself, "Barl, you're with Phoenix Holdings?" "I co-founded it," Barl said pleasantly. "Good to see you, Christine." She kept moving. At 9:47, she saw him. Mark Sterling was across the main hall, surrounded by the small, protective cluster of associates and handlers that had become his normal formation over the last several years. He was in his best suit. She recognized it. Charcoal gray had been with him when he bought it, and he was performing the room with the fluid, practiced ease of a man who had been performing rooms his entire career, laughing at the right moments, touching shoulders, making everyone feel like the most important person in the conversation for exactly as long as they needed to feel it. He had not seen her yet. She watched him for 30 seconds, long enough to verify with clinical certainty that the man she was looking at was someone she no longer recognized as anyone she had loved. The recognition used to be painful. Standing here now, 40 days later, it was simply factual. He was a person who had taken things that did not belong to him and built a life on them. She was the person he had taken them from. The rest was logistics. Then he turned, and he saw her. The performance stopped. Not dramatically. There was no dropped glass, no audible gasp. It was smaller and more devastating than that. A half-second freeze, a recalibration so fast that most people would have missed it. And then the performance resuming with a half-beat delay that told her everything about how thoroughly her presence had landed. She held his gaze across the hall for exactly 3 seconds. She did not smile. She did not look away. She simply looked at him with the steady, unafraid directness of a woman who had nothing left to hide and everything left to claim. Then she turned back to the conversation she was having as if he were entirely unremarkable. Julian, standing beside her, said very quietly, "He looked like he saw a ghost." "He saw something worse than a ghost," she said. "He saw a consequence." At 10:22, Mark's chief of staff, a young man named Derek, who Barl had met a dozen times as the wife in the background, appeared at her elbow with the specific, tight-smiled energy of someone delivering a message he had not written and did not personally endorse. "Ms. Vance," he said carefully, "Mr. Sterling was wondering if you might have 5 minutes before the keynote. Just to—" "No," she said. She did not stop moving. Derek kept pace with her for 2 steps. "He just wants to—" "Derek," she said, and she stopped and looked at him with an expression she kept deliberately kind, because Derek was not the problem. "Please tell Mark that I will see him at the appropriate time, which is after the keynote." Derek retreated. Marcus, who had appeared from somewhere to her left, said, "He is going to try to pull the keynote." "He can't," Barl said. "He is the headlining presenter. If he pulls 40 minutes before he goes on, it is the story of the summit. He knows that." "So he goes on," Marcus said. "He goes on," she confirmed. "And everything he says on that stage is said in front of every major industry contact in the country, on the record, under a regulatory cloud he cannot pretend does not exist. And when he finishes," she paused, "we respond." Marcus nodded once and moved away. At 11:15, Barl found Carol Reyes near the coffee station, and they stood together for a moment without speaking much. Carol looked composed and slightly pale and entirely committed, the look of a woman who had carried something heavy for 2 years and was about to set it down permanently. "How are you holding up?" Barl asked her. "I am ready to be done carrying this," Carol said simply. "After today," Barl said, "you will be." Carol nodded. They went to find their seats. The main auditorium held 700 people. By the time Mark Sterling walked onto the stage at 11:32, it was full. Barl was seated 8 rows back, center. Julian to her left, Marcus at the aisle, Carol 3 seats down. She watched Mark approach the podium and watched him scan the crowd with the automatic confidence of a man who had presented to large rooms many times. And she watched the precise moment when his scan reached the 8th row and found her face. His step did not falter. She gave him that. He was good. He had always been good at surfaces. He began his presentation. She listened with absolute attention to every word, not for the content she already knew, but for the spaces, the places where he shifted emphasis, the moments where the language was slightly more careful than it needed to be, the 2 times in the first 8 minutes where he used the word we in a context that had no clear referent. Building a merger story, constructing a narrative of shared vision and industry transformation, telling a room full of 700 people a version of history in which he was the only author. He spoke for 22 minutes. The Vortex merger, the future of logistics, the national consolidation that would make Streamline the backbone of American commerce for the next decade. He was smooth and confident and completely without remorse. And the applause when he paused was genuine, because the people in this room did not yet know what Barl knew. They were about to. She stood up at minute 23. The auditorium had a Q&A protocol, a standing microphone at the center aisle, a moderator managing the queue. Barl moved to the microphone before the moderator had finished announcing it was open. She was first. She stood at the microphone, 8 rows back, in a room of 700 people, and she felt completely, absolutely calm. Mark looked at her from the stage. Something moved through his face, fast, controlled, buried almost immediately under the performance, but not quite fast enough. "Ms. Vance," the moderator said, reading her badge, "Phoenix Holdings." "Thank you," she said. Her voice carried cleanly through the microphone and through the room, and she did not need to raise it at all. "Mr. Sterling, congratulations on the presentation. I have a question about the operational infrastructure underlying the Vortex merger. Specific, the client retention and attrition modeling system that Vortex has been using across its acquisition portfolio since 2020. A pause in the room. The particular quality of attention that comes when 700 people simultaneously sense that something is happening. Mark's voice was controlled. "The operational infrastructure is proprietary," he said. "It was developed internally by Vortex's technical team." "I see," she said. "Then perhaps you can explain why that system contains, in 14 distinct locations, a structural signature pattern that I developed and documented in 2018, with original creation timestamps that predate Vortex's first acquisition by 3 years. She paused. The forensic authentication confirming this was completed 18 days ago by a panel of 3 independent analysts. It has been entered as evidence in 3 separate active regulatory proceedings. The room was very still. "I am Barl Vance," she said clearly, for the room, for every journalist and industry contact and company executive in those 700 seats. "I was the operational architect of Streamline Logistics from 2012 to last year. The client retention model, the national expansion framework, and the operational backbone that Vortex Corp has been using to acquire and absorb companies across this industry, I built all of it. And it was taken without my knowledge, without my consent, and without any compensation, through a deliberate scheme that I have now fully documented." Someone in the audience said something she could not make out. A journalist in the 3rd row had their phone out. At the aisle, she could see Marcus standing with the quiet, still certainty of a man watching exactly what he had planned come to pass. Mark was gripping the sides of the podium. She could see it from 8 rows back, the whitening of his knuckles, the controlled tension in his jaw, the performance straining at its seams under a pressure it had never been designed to withstand. "These are very serious allegations," he said, and his voice was almost steady, "and entirely without—" "The regulatory bodies disagree," she said, as does Carol Reyes, the former CFO of Meridian Logistics, who is in this room today and has provided documented email evidence with your name in it, Mark, detailing the 2020 transfer of my intellectual property to Vortex's executive team. She paused for exactly 1 beat. "I believe you know Carol." Heads turned. Carol Reyes stood up from her seat, without theatrics, without drama, simply stood, and the room's collective attention swiveled and locked. Mark Sterling looked at Carol Reyes for approximately 2 seconds, and then something happened in his face that Barl had never seen there before in 12 years of marriage. something that was not the controlled, managed, performative emotion he deployed so expertly in every room. Something real, something that looked, for one exposed and unguarded moment, like fear. "This presentation is over," said someone from the wings. His chief of staff, Barl thought, or possibly his attorney. And the stage lights shifted. But the room did not quiet. The room erupted. Not in chaos, in the specific, rapid, industry professional version of eruption, which was every phone in the room simultaneously active, every conversation pivoting on a single axis, the sound of an information ecosystem recalibrating in real time. Journalists were already typing. Two people near the front were already on calls. The moderator was saying something into his microphone that nobody was listening to. Julian appeared at her shoulder. He did not touch her. He simply stood beside her, solid and present, and said very quietly, close enough that only she could hear it, "There it is." She watched Mark Sterling step back from the podium. She watched him say something sharp and low to his chief of staff. She watched Derek's face go through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. She watched Mark scan the room for a friendly face, for an exit, for anything he could use, and find none of the things he was looking for. She watched the 700 people in the room look at him the way people look at something they are recalibrating, something they thought they understood and are now understanding differently. She watched a man who had spent 12 years managing her as a risk discover that he had managed her badly. Marcus was beside her now. "Bloomberg wants a statement," he said. "So does the Journal. There are 4 other press requests in the last 3 minutes. Give them the prepared statement," she said. "The full one." "Already sent," he said. And there it was again, in his voice, that thing that was not quite delight, but was in its family. "Barl." The third regulatory body just upgraded the inquiry to a formal investigation. "I just got the notification." He paused. "The merger is effectively frozen." She absorbed that. She stood in the center aisle of an auditorium full of 700 people, and she absorbed the full, specific weight of what that meant. The merger was frozen. Vortex Corp's acquisition timeline, the $4.7 billion empire built on stolen architecture, the vehicle through which Gerald Voss had systematically dismantled the careers and companies of people who had trusted their own work to protect them. It was frozen. It was not over, not legally, not yet. The courts would take months, possibly years. There would be motions and counter-motions and the long grinding machinery of institutional justice. But the momentum had shifted in the precise, irreversible way that momentum shifts when a story becomes public knowledge in a room full of 700 people, every one of them connected, every one of them already reaching for their phones. The story was out. That was the thing that could not be undone. The story was out, and her name was in it, correctly for the first time. She found Mark Sterling once more with her eyes. He was moving toward the side exit now, a tight cluster of handlers around him, his posture carrying the particular rigid quality of a man holding himself together by sheer force of practiced will. He was going to get out of this room and get on his phone, and his lawyers were going to tell him the same thing Marcus had told her 40 days ago about fighting from a position of disadvantage. He looked back once, just before the exit door. She was looking directly at him. She had been looking directly at him. She would have been amazed if he had expected anything different. She did not smile. She did not perform victory for his benefit. She simply looked at him with the steady, unafraid eyes of a woman who had been invisible for 12 years and had chosen this morning to be visible in the most permanent and public way available to her. She looked at him and she thought, "I know every room you were in. I know every strategy you claimed. I know the real cost of every success that has your name on it." She thought all of this clearly and completely and without rage, because rage was too expensive, and she had things to build. Then she looked away, because she was done looking at Mark Sterling. There was nothing more to see. The rest of the day moved fast. press statements, 2 on-record interviews, handled calmly and precisely, with Marcus at her elbow for every word. Carol Reyes gave a brief statement to 2 journalists that was measured and devastating in equal parts. Julian handled the business press with the authority of a man who had been silent for 3 years and had chosen this moment to stop being silent. And the effect of Julian Thorne re-entering the public conversation as the co-founder of Phoenix Holdings was by itself a seismic event in the industry press, independent of everything else happening. By 4 p.m, the story had broken nationally, not just the trade publications, mainstream financial press. The combination of elements was too clean and too dramatic for any editor to resist. The reclusive billionaire, the erased wife, the stolen intellectual property, the 40-day comeback, the auditorium confrontation. By 6, Barl's name had appeared in 47 separate articles, and not one of them described her as a wife or an ex-wife or a former spouse or any version of an appendage to someone else's story. Every one of them called her a founder. At 7:30 that evening, she was sitting in the car with Julian on the way back from the summit venue when her phone showed an incoming call from a number she recognized immediately. Sandra Cole, her attorney. She answered. Barl. Sandra's voice had something in it she had not heard there before, a kind of stunned, admiring disbelief. I've been watching the coverage since 2 o'clock. A pause. I want you to know that I am sorry. For the settlement, for not pushing harder, for not... Sandra, she said, you did your job. I made the choices I made. That's behind us now. A brief silence. His legal team called me, Sandra said. They want to discuss reopening the settlement. In light of the regulatory developments, they are suggesting the original terms were... Tell them no, Barl said. Barl, there could be significant financial... I have significant financial, she said. What I want now is not a revised settlement. What I want is the public record, complete and permanent and correct. She paused. The settlement stays as it is. I don't need his money. I am going to build something worth considerably more than whatever his lawyers would offer me. Another silence, longer this time. And then Sandra Cole said, quietly and with what sounded like genuine feeling, I think you absolutely will. She hung up. Julian was looking at her with that expression, the one she had stopped trying to categorize 40 days ago and had simply started accepting as a fundamental fact of her current life. She wanted to reopen the settlement, he said. I know, she said. You said no. I said no, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Barl, after today, when the legal process runs its course, when the regulatory proceedings close, when Phoenix is fully operational and everything that was taken has been properly attributed, he stopped. He looked at her with the same directness she had been offering him for 40 days, and underneath the directness was something that had been there for a long time, and that both of them had, by mutual and unspoken agreement, held in suspension until there was space for it. I would like to have a different kind of conversation. She looked at him. The city moved past the windows in the evening dark. She thought about a rainy night and a wrong address, and a door opening on a man who had looked at her like he was expecting her. I know, she said, and she did not say anything else, and neither did he, and it was exactly enough. Phoenix Holdings held its first official board meeting on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the summit. The table was full. Marcus, Carol Reyes, who had accepted the role of chief financial officer with the specific, quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been vindicated, Julian's rebuilt legal and financial team, and 2 outside investors who had reached out in the 48 hours after the summit story broke. Because the thing about a story this clean was that the right people did not wait to see which way it fell. Barl sat at the head of the table, not to the side, not in the back, not in the auxiliary chair that was technically in the room, but not quite at the table. At the head, her chair, her company, her name, legally and publicly and permanently on the founding documents that established Phoenix Holdings as a real and operating entity in the marketplace that had, until 6 weeks ago, never heard of her. She looked at the faces around the table and felt something she did not immediately try to name. She let herself feel it first, the full, specific texture of it, without analysis. It was warm and solid and had the quality of something that had been built rather than found, earned rather than given. Marcus opened the meeting with the regulatory update. 2 investigations fully active. Vortex Corp's stock had dropped 19% since the summit. Gerald Voss had retained a new legal team, which Marcus interpreted as a signal that the old one had told him the position was untenable. The Streamline merger was on indefinite hold. 3 of Vortex's pending acquisitions had quietly withdrawn their participation in the previous 2 weeks. The empire was not collapsing. Empires did not collapse in weeks. But it was cracking, and cracks, in the right architecture, were how the whole structure eventually came down. After the meeting, when the room had emptied and it was just Julian and Barl at the long table with the remains of the morning's coffee, he said, "How does it feel, sitting at the head of it?" She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything. Not the easy answer, the real one. "It feels like what I was always supposed to be doing," she said, which is the strangest thing. It feels obvious, like looking at something that was always there and finally being in the right position to see it clearly. Julian nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "My company," he said, "the one I lost, Meridian. I spent 3 years trying to decide whether to rebuild it or let it go." He looked at her steadily. "I think I understand now why I could never decide. I was waiting for the right foundation." She held his gaze for a long moment. And then she said, "Is this the different conversation you mentioned in the car?" "It is the beginning of it," he said. She looked at him, this man who had opened a door in the rain without asking any questions she wasn't ready for, who had seen her work before he knew her name, who had spent 3 years of his own life in the same determined, methodical rebuilding that she had compressed into 40 extraordinary days. She looked at him and she thought, some doors you walk through by accident, and some accidents are the most deliberate thing that ever happens to you. "Then let's keep talking," she said. He smiled. Not the almost smile she had learned to read over 40 days, the careful, contained expression of a man who had been alone in his own discipline for too long. A real smile, unhurried and unguarded. The smile of a man who had stopped waiting. 3 months later, Phoenix Holdings filed suit against Vortex Corp for intellectual property theft, unjust enrichment, and tortious interference in a civil proceeding that Marcus described with characteristic understatement as the most comprehensive IP case he had built in 30 years of practice. Carol Reyes testified. The forensic analyst testified. The emails with Mark Sterling's name in them were entered into evidence and reported in full by every major financial publication in the country. 6 months later, Gerald Voss settled. The terms were not public, which was a concession Marcus had made deliberately, not to protect Voss, but because the details of the settlement were less important than what would remain on the public record permanently. The findings, the attribution, the establishment in every court filing and regulatory document of exactly whose work had built what. 8 months after a rainy night and a wrong address, and a door opening on a future she had not seen coming, Barl Vance stood at the window of the Phoenix Holdings executive suite and looked out at the city and thought about a woman who had stood on a courthouse steps believing she had nothing. That woman had been wrong. She had not had nothing. She had had everything that mattered, the work, the mind, the capacity to survive being underestimated and emerge from it not diminished, but clarified. She had had 12 years of invisible expertise, building something in the dark that turned out to be unassailable in the light. Julian came to stand beside her at the window. He did not say anything. He did not need to. This was one of the things she had come to know about him, that he understood the difference between a silence that needed to be filled and a silence that was itself the thing. She looked out at the city. She thought about the 40 days. She thought about Carol and Marcus and Sandra Cole's voice on the phone. She thought about 700 people in an auditorium and a podium, and a man whose knuckles had gone white. She thought about a sentence she had written on a blank page the night before everything changed. Tomorrow, I stop being invisible. She had stopped. Completely, permanently, and on her own terms. She was the founder of Phoenix Holdings, the woman who had built the architecture that an industry ran on, the person whose name was now in the correct place on every document that mattered. She was visible, powerful, and precisely herself. Mark Sterling had thrown her out into the rain, believing she was finished. He had been wrong about that, too. He had been wrong about everything. And Barl Vance, CEO, founder, architect of her own unstoppable comeback, was only just beginning. Sonnet 4.6 Extended.